Welcome to the How People Grow podcast season 5. This is a special bonus episode. And in season 5, we've been talking about how to live a rooted life. And as we finish up 2025, I was working on a Substack blog, and the content I was writing about I thought was relevant. So I figured I'd also turn it into a podcast. So as we finish up this year, and we're entering into the holiday season, it is a time frame that often feels like a collision of values. I was thinking of it when I was buying my kids presents. I was like, I really don't want to spend this money, but I think I'm supposed to. Some of you probably had that that same feeling. And I just thought, in light of that, we're talking about being rooted. And so I thought, what a better time to then now to do this. So how do we live rooted? How do we live connected to something deeper that's beyond the surface level noise that we see in our world? So in this last season, I invited many of my friends and heroes to come and let me ask them that question about how to live a rooted life. So if you haven't heard it yet, go back and listen to those interviews. But today we have a bonus. And the bonus is just a simple Christmas message. I was reading through a sermon I gave years ago in 2018 for a church that I helped start. And the title of that message was called Jesus on the Margins. And I remember I wrote it at the time because I sensed a different version of Christianity was taking hold in our region of the country. And it felt more political, and it felt less like a spiritual movement. And as I reflected on this week, I felt like it might be a good time to bring it back. So go and read that on Substack. It comes out today, which is Friday, December 19. And you also get a version of it here. And I wanted to release this because I think at the heart of our growth is this question about belief and action. And the question is, do I follow the religion about Jesus or the religion of Jesus? And if you look at the beginning of the gospel story in the book of Matthew, you find an introduction to the story of Jesus with these characters called the Magi. And the introduction in Matthew is really strategic. It's kind of a stunning reveal of what this child king is actually about. So I want to tell you about who these Magi were. These are people who come from a very long way away. In fact, it was probably about 1,600 miles. Some estimate maybe a little shorter, but let's say about 1,600. These were, in the Greek, the word means literally magicians, sorcerers, or astrologers. They were the intellectual elite. I had a friend of mine who said, wait a minute, I thought they were astronomers. And I think that's maybe a more sanitized view of this. We forget that these were days when magicians, sorcerers, and astrologers were at the tippy top of wisdom holders. They were the ones who were the court advisors for kings. And these were probably court advisors of the Persian Empire. So they were the brightest of the world's wisdom tradition at that time. So they make this really long journey from the edge of Persia to Jerusalem, which was about 1,600 miles. So put that into perspective. Where I live is Chattanooga, Tennessee. That's like walking from Chattanooga to Phoenix, Arizona. Or for my European friends, that's like walking from the tip of Spain to Copenhagen, Denmark. It's a journey that would have taken about 48 days of walking if you walk 12 hours a day. So likely it took longer than that. And so what happens is that Matthew introduces Jesus with this backdrop. Here's these intellectually elite, and he's showing us this because he wants us to see that the way of God operates completely different than the wisdom of the world. It's a completely different plane. And so this story is really showing us the limits of our own wisdom. So we have these Magi, and they arrive in Jerusalem, which is the urban center of power. So they've been on the road for quite some time, but their wisdom reaches this wall. They could see what was happening in the heavens. They knew it was pointing to a king that was going to be born, but it couldn't tell them exactly where the child king was at. And this is an interesting pattern we see all through Scripture, which is fascinating to me. We see it in the story of Pharaoh. When Pharaoh has dreams, he calls in his wise men, and they know that Pharaoh's getting significant dreams, but they can't tell him what it means. Same thing happens with Nebuchadnezzar. He has these dreams, but his people couldn't tell what the dreams meant. They knew they were significant. And in these cases, an outsider had to be brought in, someone from the margins. So Joseph helps Pharaoh. Daniel helps Nebuchadnezzar. And it's the same thing happening here. And what happens is you have these scholars from Persia. They go to the center of power because that's where they think you should go. They likely interacted with the religious scholars, the Jewish religious scholars, which probably pointed them to Micah chapter 5, verse 2. And what Micah 5:2 says is that Bethlehem was a significant place where the Messiah would be born. So here's a quote. It says, "Bethlehem, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come one who will rule over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." It's my paraphrase. So the Magi go to the center of power. They run to the religious scholars who say something significant is actually in Bethlehem. And again, I'm reading into it, but likely. How else would they have found Bethlehem? And so the Magi, they leave the center of power and they go to Bethlehem, which is like a little poor outskirt town. And so what do the intellectual elite find that helps them make sense of these stars? All this amazing stuff they can discern from the sky. Are they going to find another king or a palace? They go to Bethlehem, and do you know what they find? A poor family with a child probably in a feeding trough and likely in a cave. And as I was rereading some of this and thinking about this podcast and the article I wrote on Substack, I thought of something Richard Rohr has written. And he says, Jesus is the ultimate marginal man. He was born on the outskirts of power, lived as a refugee, and died outside the city gates. It's powerful. The ultimate marginal man. And this brings us to a concept I've been dwelling on lately. And I've been thinking about the Old Testament, in particular, a vision that Jacob had. When he had a dream of what God was like, he saw a ladder. And it's a vision of connection between the divine and the dirt. And if you fast forward to the Gospel of John, Jesus is described in John 1 as the Word, the Logos. In an ancient thought, the Logos was the underlying logic or blueprint of the universe. So if you put these together, what you see in Jesus is that we find a kind of living ladder. He is the Word made flesh, a way of living that is finally in line with what God is actually like. But notice this ladder, it doesn't lead to a palace filled with golden things. It leads to a manger. And I think this story really does expose the shallowness of worldly wisdom and strategic thinking. I keep coming back to the Magi's instinct to go to Herod in the big city. And it reflects our obsession for all time with power and influence. Worldly wisdom asks questions like, is this move strategic? And it reminds me of when I was planting a church many years ago, and I was meeting with somebody who had the ability to help us financially. He was a church planting specialist. And he asked me, how is this move strategic? And in a better moment, I said, Well, was Nazareth strategic? And to his credit, he said, "You got me on that one." See, the world's way of thinking is it's one-dimensional and it's linear. It's kind of like my work in the corporate world. You develop strategies with goals and you track it. But God's way is the opposite. God's way says, if you want to go up, you go down. If you want the way to life, it's death. And it reminds me of what Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote when he said, when Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. The logic of the world does not understand that, but that's the logic of the Word. That's the logic of Jesus. And when I reflect on this, I think about how I'm changing the older I get. And I'm becoming more and more a fan of the religion of Jesus. What I mean by that is the radical teachings of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7. That's where Jesus talks about how it's the poor and the hungry. They're the ones who are blessed. They're the ones who are filled. That's the religion of Jesus. And I think I'm finding myself becoming less and less a follower of the religion about Jesus. And I think that's what we see in popular culture today. And it's a religion that prioritizes strategy. It prioritizes effectiveness and power. And honestly, I think it mirrors King Herod. And Herod in the story in Matthew 2 was so desperate to protect his authority, he slaughtered all the children that were around about the age of a newborn because he wanted to maintain his stability, his position of power. And that's not the part we hear a lot in the Christmas story, but it's there. And so we have to ask ourselves, if we turn a mirror on ourselves, and we have to ask, who have we discarded or who have we pushed out because they threatened our prosperity? There's a lot I'm not saying here that I'm sure you might be putting together. Who are we pushing out because they threaten our prosperity? You see, our popular wisdom, it chases political supremacy, it chases social approval. But the unfortunate byproduct, if we live that way, is that if we seek that kind of power, we end up pushing out the powerless. Back to Matthew 5-7, the hungry, the poor, and the immigrant, in our case right now in this country. They're discarded as unstrategic, unhelpful, which isn't true. But the religion of Jesus says something different. The religion of Jesus says, I was the strongest, but I made myself weak and a servant. So is it any surprise that Jesus taught us that the kingdom belongs to the poor in spirit and the peacemakers? Why? It's because they're the ones who are giving away themselves on behalf of others. So let's come back to the Magi. In this story, the journey of the Magi, we find something like a mandate, and I think a caution. It's that if you go in with Jesus, the religion of Jesus, you will find yourself among the same people he found himself with, which is those on the margins. But it's not entirely about the margins, because if you read the story, you'll notice that the shepherds were there too. So we have the child king bringing together two very different groups, it seems. The wise of the day, the wealthy of the day, but also the simple, the rich, and the poor. So at the margins, we actually find everyone who has reached the edge of their wisdom. And to me, that's pretty cool. It's cool because we often say it's either these people or those people, but the story of Jesus says it's everyone who can admit, who can come to the end of their own wisdom and understanding. And so, as we finish up, I want to tell you this. The Magi are fascinating in this story. People who've come to the edge of their wisdom and they find Jesus, and it says they rejoice exceedingly. So maybe there is a message here for us this Christmas in 2025. And maybe some encouraging news. It's that when our efforts are exhausted, there is a wisdom outside ourselves to guide us. This is the miracle of Christmas. And the miracle is that the strongest of all made himself weak, so that we might find what true authority and power look like. So this season, this holiday season, the end of this year, the beginning of 2026, what would it look like for you to stop agreeing with the dominant culture's shallow rules? The path to true riches and meaning isn't found in seeking the center of power and safety, but it's found in humble surrender to the one who redefined what it means to be a king. So Merry Christmas, my friends. Happy holidays. And thanks for listening to the How People Grow podcast. I'm David Achata. Bless you as you finish up this year and begin 2026. Stay rooted.